All right, hello once again. This is Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College. And as part of the Rankin Technical College AWD, or Application and Website Development Program, and in particular the AWD1111 .NET Framework with Web Databases course, I've been going through a 12-article series by DotNetOdyessy entitled ASP.NET MVC5 free course. Now, let's talk about it just for a second here. I went through Chapter 1. There was really nothing that I could screw up. It was just an overview. Went through Chapter 2, your first ASP.NET application, no problems. Went through Chapter 3, I don't believe there were any problems. Went through Chapter 4, and I did have a little bit of a problem in that the layout didn't show the application name with the little black bar along the top that I was supposed to have. Chapter 5, I think went okay. Chapter 6, there were some problems with the entity framework. They were more on my end. Okay. Chapter 7, the CSS and Twitter Bootstrap, not a problem. Chapter 8, setting up the micro IMDb v2 application. I think that went okay. Chapter 9, data modeling. All right. Again, I believe that went okay. Chapter 10 with the CRUD, a couple issues. But I think that, again, it probably went back between 8, 9, and 10. I probably had a mistake in the setup. I'm going to go through Chapter 11 right now on validation, and then Chapter 12 on updating and deleting data. Now, I'm going to tell you this. You may laugh. You may not believe me. But I actually think that when I go through these, first of all, the reason I go through them is probably what you'd think, and that is so that I've gone through them so that once I go through them with my students, I'll have gone through them once, and hopefully any errors that I found, I know how to resolve them. That's the first thing. All right? But again, I will say this, you may or may not believe me, but I actually look at it that when things go wrong, it's a good thing. I'd much rather have them go wrong when I'm, quote, practicing, unquote, kind of what I'm doing here, as opposed to doing it live. All right? I've mentioned this story to my classes before. I had a friend when I went, I got right out of high school. I was 17 years old. I was a punk. And I immediately went on to college to the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. And I had 3 jobs at the time, sometimes working darn close to 80 hours a week. All right? Well, bottom line is I got through it, didn't get a job out of that. I was going to become the new Clark Kent, not Superman, but Clark Kent. I was going to be a star reporter, and it just didn't really work out. So, kept my day job, ended up going back to school to get an IT degree. The reason I'm telling you that is the first real IT class that I took, where we had to actually write a lot of programs, was a class in a language that's not used much anymore, but it's called COBOL, Common Business Oriented Language. The reason I'm telling you this story is when I had my first program in there, if you don't know anything about COBOL, you have to end a lot of things with a period, like you would when you're writing. And I left off a period near the top of the program, and it gave me about, 150 errors throughout the program. There were other errors as well. But I methodically made my way through from top to bottom and figured out all the errors. Meanwhile, a friend of mine, Larry, next to me, typed in his program, had no errors, boom, it ran, and boom, he left. All right? But the next time we had an assignment, I probably had about 10 or 15 errors, where he had a ton of errors. I knew how to go through mine real fast because I had done it before. So I always look at this as when I have mistakes and make mistakes, it's a good thing. All right, end of sermon. We're on Part 11 of 12 on validation. In our last chapter, we saved movie information to the database. Still having some problems with that. As we are not validating the data, there's a possibility of correct data being saved to the database. To avoid this, you should always validate user input. Now, as it says here, there's 2 types of validation. You can validate on the client side. You can validate on the server side. to make it even more confusing, if you'd call it that, is, for example, in most web-based applications, you will first validate on the client side. Why? Well, because if you've got errors on the client, where you can find it, why would you send anything out to a server if you already know that there are errors in it? You're making the server do work that technically it doesn't have to do, which really, when you think about it, doesn't make a lot of sense. All right? But quite often what ends up happening, just so you know this, is that you validate on the client side, and then once all validations pass, you send it over to the server and you perform sometimes virtually the same validations. Why would that be? Well, it is possible that if you're validating using JavaScript, that the person could have JavaScript, for example, turned off on their machine. It happens. All right? That could very well happen. So again, you quite often run the same tests on both the client side and, if it succeeds, again on the server side. So that's my take. The author says here, when the user submits a form with data, you'll receive the request in the controller. You can use the model to validate the user input. If there's no issue with the data, you can save it to the database. If the input is not in the correct format, you shouldn't save the data. Rather, you should give the user an error message and ask him or her to enter the data in a correct format or whatever it happens to be, and then resubmit it. And that's what they're showing here. You can validate some stuff on the client end. Okay, we've already talked about this. For example, if you've not entered a title and a title is required, you can tell the user to do so. Pretty much what I've talked about. Again, in most client-server applications, you'll try to validate data on the client side. If there's no issue, you submit to the server. All right, where it may be validated further against the model. I'd say it should be validated further against the model. If the validation is successful, then you can save the data to the database. Otherwise, you inform the user that it's invalid and you ask them to put it in the correct format. Again, I'm not going over what's in these papers because I kind of gave you my take on it ahead of time. First, we're going to do server-side validation. Then we would use both client and server validation as depicted earlier. So, validation, as it says, is the process of comparing the entered data to the expected data. I like that definition. So first we need to define what correct data is. For example, in our movie, we could say the title field is required. We could also say that it has to be greater than 1900. All right? So the author modified the movie model class. Let's take a quick look at what they put in. The maximum length of the title is 100 characters. If you go over 100, it'll come back and say title can't be greater than 100 characters, and it's required. The release date, all right, that year, it's required, and it should be between 1900 and 2020. Not bad. Notice in order to use this, we have to now add another using statement, and that is using system.componentModel.data annotations. These things that we're putting in front of our field names are known as data annotations. So I'm going to come back here. I'm going to go over back to my movie model class. And the first thing I'm going to do is to come up here and add my using statement. Now again, boom, it turns gray. I'm not using it yet, but I will use it in just a minute. All right, so let's go back. And we want to go back in and add this stuff right here. Again, I'm going to get rid of that non-breaking space. I don't know why the author has that in there, but the author has that in there. All right. And I believe this is the one we're fixing or working on or whatever you want to call it. So there's the ID. Again, I'm getting rid of that. So notice we've now said this is required, and we've said the max length is 100. If you go past that, you're going to get this message. I do believe that the order in which you put in these annotations is irrelevant. At least that's what I've always been told. All right. I think I somehow removed that. There we go. All right. Again, we've said that the release year is required and it has to fall within a certain range as well. All right. Now, you don't have to do this, but notice what I've done here. Now I've got the blank line in between each one. To me, it makes it much easier, much easier to go through and look at that and be able to decide how something should be set up, where one field ends and the next one begins, etc. So they go through this and they say, again, required tells that the property is required for this model. And it's one thing to make it required, but it's another thing to add a message. If you don't, you get a generic message. But here you can customize it. Title of the movie is required. Again, we've set the maximum length to be 100 characters. You can set a minimum length as well. All right. The year is also required. If you leave it off, release year is required. And you've got a range in there between 1900 and 2020. Now, there's different ways that you can do this too. I mean, we could come up with the current. Maybe there's some movies that are out there that are in production that won't be out there for 3 years. All right, that would be 2022. So you could check the current year and maybe add 10 to it. So it was between 1900 and the current year plus 10, something like that. It says, if you run the application after making the above changes, you'll get an error like the one below. It says there's a mismatch between what's in the database and what you just added to the model. All right. By default, when we put our things into the database, they probably were given a length for strings of like max varchar. All right. They weren't given a size. It was just as big as you want them to be. All right. By convention, also types such as numeric types like int or double would become not null in the tables in the database. You wouldn't want to be able to leave them blank. So what we should have in here is ID, primary key, should not be null. The title, all right, was originally, I think it was null, and the year should not be null. So in other words, when you look at what we have in here, after you add the data annotation, you want the title to be not null, and you want the max length to be 100. All right? It says, as we have not changed anything else in the database, there will be a mismatch between our model definition and our table definition. So we can use what are referred to as data migrations, all right, to try to keep these things in conjunction or whatever you want to call it with one another. So it says we can use database migrations of the entity framework to sync our tables with our model definition. We have to enable the migrations, and then we have to update the database. So to enable the migrations, here's the command. Again, you never use the actual double quotes there, but it's enable minus migrations with a big E for enable, with a big M for migrations, space, hit the space bar, minus one word, enable automatic migrations, where the E in enable, the A in automatic, and the M in migration are all capitalized. All right, so I'm going to put it in there. I may end up getting an error message, all right, with the luck that I have been having. So again, I wanted tools, NuGet Package Manager console, put that in, hit enter. Now, if it turns red, if it does turn red, that means that there's some kind of an error. All right? Didn't give me an error, so evidently it has no problem with what I'm trying to do. It says a folder with the name of migrations should be created with the configuration file. Let's check. There's the migrations folder, and it now has a configuration.cs file in it. This seed method is where we would put all of our beginning data as we start to create the project. And again, I'm not silly enough to think, oh, that totally makes sense to everybody. All right? It's the kind of thing that you've got to work on a little bit and look at it, but really don't make something out of it that isn't there. In other words, it's not that difficult a concept to comprehend. All right, I'm at 17.5 minutes. So I'm going to go and stop right here with updating the database. I will be back with part 2 of my presentation of this, the 11th of 12 articles in the series, in just a couple minutes.